Hi, Mariners Online. I'm Christine Caine. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Mariners Church, and I am so glad that you've joined us today as we continue our series from the book of Daniel. I'm loving this series. I hope you are too. Now, we're unpacking today a very familiar and action-packed chapter of the book, and I mean, this chapter is the stuff that superhero movies are literally made of. It includes a ginormous gold statue, a narcissistic king, a very, very hot furnace, a super courageous young people, now the appearance of a supernatural being, and a plot twist at the end. So you're going to want to listen all the way through. Now, this is action-packed from beginning to end, and it has kept people intrigued for literally hundreds of years. But if we're not careful, we could put this chapter in the category of kind of the latest Marvel movie release and read it like a fictional story instead of a true historical account. Now, the events that I'm about to read actually did happen. The unbelievable courage of 3 teenage boys, they kept their faith when it was literally under fire. They ended up changing the course of history. These teenage boys were pressured to compromise their faithfulness for the one true God and to conform to the cultural values and expectations and norms of their time, just like you and I are each and every day today. Now, I don't know of a time in my lifetime where this particular chapter of the Bible has had more relevance for me personally than right at this moment. You know, things have changed in our world at such a rapid pace. And as the Western world is becoming increasingly secularized and moved into what's called a post-Christian era, I think that you and I are going to find that this chapter relates to us more than we ever thought that it could in our lifetime. Now, some of the things you and I are facing today couldn't have even seemed possible when we were kids, let alone the rate at which cultural, moral, and societal change has happened over the past few years. Now, most of us know that there are countries in the world where people have been and are being persecuted for their faith in Jesus. But for those of us living in the West, we've had to face relatively little resistance towards our faith. And in fact, most of us have enjoyed incredible religious freedoms compared to many of our brothers and sisters around the world. Now, I remember being invited to a certain country in Asia where our host had organized for 500 members of the leaders of the 4 largest streams of the underground church in China to gather together at this conference. Now, this was quite a process to have this secret gathering and to ensure the safety of every one of those leaders. For several days, I sat with different leaders and I listened to so many stories of great faith and great courage. Now, almost every single one of the leaders that I spent time with, they had spent time in prison and had been persecuted because they chose to follow Jesus when it was illegal to do so. In fact, they had invited me to this particular gathering to teach them leadership principles and how to reach young people. Now, one of the leaders, I'll never forget them, they said to me, Christine, we were never taught leadership, as most of us were uneducated agricultural workers during the revival. And the only thing we were taught was how to witness to our prison guards on the way to our execution. Now, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it was at that point, I remember looking at the leaders and I said, I don't know what you think that I can actually teach you, because right now, personally, I don't feel that I've got anything to offer you. And I've got so much to learn from you. And I remember with that, I got down on my knees and I asked those leaders to lay their hands on me and to pray for me. I said to them, I want the fire that they carried for the gospel to be imparted to me. And I wanted their faith and their courage and their conviction and their faithfulness to the gospel. I wanted to bring that back here. You know, there's a fiery faith that is developed when your faith has been through the fire. And these Chinese leaders, they possess that kind of faith, and I wanted some of that faith. So with that, let's turn to Daniel chapter 3 and read the word of the Lord. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to attend the dedication of the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue the king had set up. Then they stood before the statue Nebuchadnezzar had set up. A herald loudly proclaimed, "People of every nation and language, you are commanded, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, you are to fall face down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and every kind of music, people of every nation and language fell down and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. You, as king, have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Then in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I have made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he committed some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing fire. So these men, in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes, were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" "Yes, of course, Your Majesty," they replied to the king. He explained, "Look, I see 4 men not tied walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, "You servants of the Most High God, come out." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair of their heads was singed. Their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar explained, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and his house made a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now this is the word of the Lord. Now, there is obviously, as you can see, a lot of action happening in this chapter of Daniel. The first thing that we notice is that Daniel, the central personality of this entire book that we're studying in this series, he doesn't even appear in chapter 3 at all. It's actually his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that are the main characters here. Now, most commentators seem to agree that Daniel was not in Babylon when these events took place. Now, he may have been on official government business somewhere else. These three friends of Daniel had been promoted at the end of chapter 2 to a position of power and privilege in the government as managers of the province of Babylon. So in chapter 3, verse 1, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar decided to set up a gold statue that was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and had commanded everyone to bow down and worship this image. Now, we actually know very little about the image Nebuchadnezzar set up, so no one really knows if the image was a representation of the king or of a Babylonian god or something totally different. But whatever it was massive and it was definitely daunting. Now, for most people in Babylon, bowing down to worship another idol, it wasn't a big deal because they worship many different gods. And this was just like another one to add to the collection. It's also important to note that God's people were not asked to stop worshiping their own God. They were just asked to worship the gods of the culture as well. See, they could keep worshiping their God as long as they bowed down to this idol as well. But for Jewish people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bowing down to worship an idol was strictly forbidden. The second of the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 to 5 says, "Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow in worship to them and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." It is obvious from this commandment that God was serious about his people, neither making idols for themselves nor bowing down to idols. And the three boys would have been well aware of this commandment. Can you imagine the position that they found themselves in? I mean, just think about this. On one hand, the king, for whom they worked as exiles in Babylon, had commanded everyone to bow down to this idol. And he threatened those that wouldn't bow down to that idol, that they would be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Now, on the other hand, the God who they served explicitly prohibited this action. So what do you do? What do you do when you are faced with the consequence? Do I break the law of the land or the 10 commandments? If I break the 10 commandments, I'll die in a furnace. So these guys would have faced almost unbearable pressure to conform to the expectations of the culture around them and to obey the king's edict. I mean, death by fire is not something that anybody wants. And apparently, thousands of Jewish exiles did bow to this idol because verse 7 tells us people of every nation and language fell down and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, to be honest with you, I think most of us read a story like this and we think that idol worship is unsophisticated and it's something that we would never be tempted to do, especially here in the civilized West. We tend to think of idolatry as a sin of the past or something in Eastern mysticism. We certainly don't think we have modern day idols, not in our culture. Now, I mean, most of us are not bowing down to a golden statue in an ancient temple, and we're not praying to a wooden trinket. At least I don't think that we are. But the truth is, that idolatry is very prevalent in our culture right here, right now, in the 21st century. You know, in his book, Counterfeit Gods, Tim Keller wrote, "An idol is something that we look to for things that only God can give." Now, I love this definition because it helps us to understand that idols are more than statues or trinkets. Anyone or anything can become an idol if we place the value for that thing or that person above our value for God. Now, whenever something becomes more important to us than God, then that thing or that person has actually become an idol. Now, Tim Keller goes on to say in the same book, "An idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I will feel that my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure." Now, no doubt, the things we look to for security and significance, value and meaning can be different for each and every one of us. For some of us, it's our identity. Instead of placing our identity in who we are in Christ, we've placed it in our social media following, or perhaps our position at work, or our achievements, or our status, or our skills, or our abilities. For some of us, it can be money or material things, or an obsession with our physical appearance, or entertainment, or sport, or sex, or comfort, or technology, or fame, or family. I mean, the list is endless. Basically, all of these things can be good things, and some of these things are even necessary. But when a good thing becomes an ultimate thing, then that thing has become an idol in our life. I think if we were honest today, we all have something in our lives at different times that has become an idol for us. Now, we might not want to say it aloud or admit it to ourselves, but the truth is, we value that person or that thing more than we value God. We fear losing that person or that thing more than we fear disobeying, dishonoring, or displeasing God. Perhaps the gap between Daniel chapter 3 and our lives today is not quite as big as we first thought that it was. We're all tempted to bow down to idols each and every day. And the big question is, will we remain faithful to Jesus, or are we going to bow? When the music began, everyone except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bowed down and worshiped the idol. No doubt the peer pressure was immense, and it would have been much easier to go with the flow than to resist. I wonder if, like me, you have ever done anything you didn't really want to do, but you did it because everyone else was doing it. No matter how old we are, I've got to say, peer pressure is a very real thing. Nobody wants to be left out. No one wants to be ostracized or ridiculed or ignored or canceled or punished. We all long to belong, and we all want to be included. It's not easy to stand firm when everyone around us is bowing. Now, in verse 8, we see that some of the Chaldeans who had noticed that the 3 Jewish boys did not bow, they reported them to the king. Now, in verse 12, they accused them of showing disregard for the king's authority, for not serving his gods, and for not bowing down to the image that Nebuchadnezzar had erected. Now, remember, these were the same men who basically owed their lives to Daniel and his friends. Had Daniel not interpreted the king's dream in chapter 2, Pastor Eric talked about that last week, all the wise men of the land would have been put to death, and yet this was the way they showed their gratitude. Some commentators highlighted the fact that there also seems to be a hint of anti-Semitism when they referred to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as some Jews when accusing them to the king. This is so pertinent for us today. This could have had something to do with them reporting this matter to the king. The king, not used to being disobeyed, responds to these accusations with furious rage. And because he had appointed these boys to their high positions, his own reputation was now at stake. And so he gave them a second chance. In verse 15, he said that he would instruct the orchestra to play once more. And if they bowed down, the matter would be forgotten. So then he asks a really important question in verse 15. He says, who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Now, I personally love the way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king. They said, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. Can you believe the courage and confidence of these three teenage boys? I mean, in this moment, their lives are literally on the line, but they choose to remain faithful to God, no matter what the cost is going to be. They refused to bow down. They were willing to lose their titles, their positions, and if necessary, even their lives. Now, I have to wonder if they were thinking of the words of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote in Isaiah 43:2, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and the rivers will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, and the flame will not burn you. Now, this moment is challenging for every single one of us. Are we willing to take a stand for what is right? Or will we compromise to keep the status quo in our world? Will we do what everyone else is doing, even if God says that it's wrong? Would we do something illegal or immoral or unethical just to keep our jobs? Will we follow our hearts or will we follow Jesus? Will we stay faithful to our spouse or are we going to give in to temptation? Will we follow God's sexual ethic or are we going to follow our hormones? Basically, our convictions are never really tested until they're tested. It's easy to say we believe the word of God and that we trust God until the moment that we're in a position where it will cost us to stand by what we profess to believe. It may not be as dramatic as it was for these three young men, but make no mistake, every single one of us will face the test of a fiery furnace. You know, in verse 18, we read some of the most courageous words ever spoken in history. When these three young men said, but even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. You know, those three words, but even if, are a powerful statement of faith. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that God had the power to deliver them from the furnace, but they also realized that in his sovereignty, he might choose not to. Either way, they were not going to bow. It is one thing to have faith when you know that you will get the outcome that you want, and it's an entirely different level of faith that is required when you choose to trust God, no matter what the outcome is going to be. The real question is whether we will trust God even when we cannot trace him. Will we trust that God is good and does good even if the situation we find ourselves in is not good? And that, my friends, is the test of true faith. I'm reminded of the words of Job, who endured inconceivable suffering and he lost all of his family and worldly possessions. And yet in Job chapter 13, verse 15, he said, even if he kills me, I will hope in him. The prophet Habakkuk wrote, though the fig tree does not bud and there is no fruit on the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though the flocks disappear from the pen and there are no herds in the stalls, yet I will celebrate in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. You know, God has never said that we would never suffer or experience loss or disappointment or betrayal or pain or injustice while living in this fallen world. But he has promised to be with us in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. So whatever you're facing today, can I remind you that your God is with you? He will never leave you nor forsake you. I know you might be wondering, will God save my marriage? Will my kids come to faith? Will we get through this economic challenge? Will that opportunity finally open up for me? Will my friend be healed? I can't guarantee the outcome for you today, but I know that God can be trusted regardless of the outcome. So I wonder, would you trust him in the trial, and remain faithful, allowing the refiner to refine you in the process? You know, in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 to 7, Peter writes, "You rejoice in this, even though now for a short time, if necessary, you suffer grief in various trials, so that the proven character of your faith, more valuable than gold, which though perishable, is refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." Listen, I know it's not easy to stay in faith when things get tough, and we're all going through something right now. But I want to remind you today that our God is at work, and our fiery trials and the process is the testing of the genuineness of our faith. The reality is that obedience to God took these men to a blazing furnace. So it's important to notice that this was an act of peaceful civil disobedience. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not go on a public rant. They simply stood firm and followed their convictions. You know, I think this is one of the most effective ways that you and I can make a stand for what we believe in our very divided and contentious times right now. We must live out what we believe without anger or arguments or malice or judgment. It's just so easy to post our opinions or to vent on social media, but you know what? It's much more difficult to live them out when we can feel the flames of a fiery furnace on our very own skin. So would we be willing to live this thing out when the rubber really hits the road? You see, these three courageous young men, they proved that their ultimate loyalty was to their God above everything else. Now, the king was so angry with their response that he had the heat of the furnace turned up 7 times the normal temperature and ordered the 3 young men to be thrown into the furnace. Now, it was so hot in that furnace that the soldiers who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire were literally killed by the fire. It was so intense. The amazing thing is that what these young men found in the furnace actually changes everything forever. So you see, God didn't deliver them from the fire, but he had a purpose for allowing them to go into that fire. It was in the fire that an amazing thing happened. King Nebuchadnezzar couldn't believe what he was witnessing with his very own eyes. In verse 24, he said to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" And then in verse 25, he exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men not tied, walking around in the fire, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." You know, no one really knows who this 4th man in the fire was. Some scholars think it was an angel. Others believe it was a Christophany, which is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. Whichever it might be, the important thing is that it shows that the presence of God was with them in the fire. And in the same way, you and I, we can expect to find the presence of God with us in our fiery trials. I want to remind you today that Jesus will help us bear the trial, or he will deliver us from the trial. Either way, he's always with us. He's never going to leave us nor forsake us. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, they were unbound. The fire had no effect on their bodies, and there was not even the smell of smoke on their clothes. I love that part. This is miraculous. This is supernatural. They were not delivered from the fire. They felt every bit of the scorching heat, but they were protected by God in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar was so profoundly impacted by the sight of the 4th man in the fire and the fact that the 3 young men had not been harmed by the flames, that he ended up granting them religious freedom, and he promoted them in his administration. You know, the courage and faithfulness of these 3 teenage boys impacted every Jewish person in exile in Babylon. Everyone witnessed the power of the one true God that these 3 boys worship. So I want to remind you today that you never know what impact your faithfulness to Jesus in the fiery trials of life will have on those around you and the generations that are going to come after you. Every single one of us needs courage to navigate the days in which we live. And man, the culture that we are immersed in is brutal. The resistance that you and I encounter, It's hard. So we want to be people of love and compassion and grace and mercy and peace. But please make no mistake, our faith will be tested time and time and time again. Every one of us is going to feel the heat in these days. The good news is that we're never alone. Jesus won't leave us. He won't forsake us. He's always faithful, and he is worthy of every single one of us standing firm in these challenging days.
Hey, I'm so glad that you joined us for our service today. And I hope and pray that God used this message to encourage you right where you are. I'd love if you hit the subscribe button, because then you could get the next alert for whenever we have services and when we ever offer content here on YouTube. So subscribe and join us for Mariners Online.